Hey there, Neutron Tech crew. Today's episode features Mr. Woodworking and his incredible coffee table build. We're talking about transforming a genuine century-old tree stump, this enormous slice of trunk, into something spectacular. What you're about to witness is a complete transformation journey. He'll walk this ancient piece of wood through every phase, getting it ready, sculpting it into shape, and applying the final touches. When it's all said and done, you'll see an absolutely gorgeous, totally unique coffee table that highlights everything beautiful about this natural material. Since this stump comes from a tree that stood for a full century, you're looking at old-growth timber packed with character and history. Before turning it into furniture, he has to make sure the wood is solid, properly dried, and completely free from insects or decay. The sweet spot for moisture content? Somewhere between 8–15% equilibrium. Getting that bark off is a major part of the prep work, especially since old stumps usually come with all their bark still clinging on. He grabs a hammer and chisel, sometimes a pry bar, and strips away every bit of bark until nothing but clean wood remains. Here's the thing. A stump that's been around for 100 years is usually massive and all over the place in terms of shape, so he's got to trim it down to workable dimensions. Job number 1, creating a flat surface on top, because that's going to be your actual tabletop. The same treatment goes for the bottom section, the part that'll either rest on the floor or sit on legs. He levels that out using a chainsaw, making whatever cuts are necessary. But there's more to consider than just making things flat. Height matters too. Most coffee tables land somewhere around 16 to 18 inches tall. Like we mentioned earlier, removing all that bark is one of those foundational tasks that takes serious elbow grease. It's absolutely critical for keeping the structure sound, making sure the finish actually sticks, and giving the whole piece that refined look. After the outer bark comes off, he moves on to the trickier stuff, that stubborn inner bark, and the deteriorated sapwood. On stumps this old, that layer can be crumbly, almost powder-like, sometimes looking and feeling like charcoal because of decay. He keeps working with precise chisel movements, sometimes switching to a gouge or narrower chisel when he needs to get into tight recessed spots. Sure, this manual approach takes way longer than firing up a power grinder or wire brush, but it comes with real benefits. For starters, it keeps all those natural curves, grain patterns, and organic edges intact without over-smoothing or accidentally ripping out chunks of material. Once the rough outer layer and loose bits are completely gone, you're left with clean wood that's ready for progressively smoother sanding. First though, there's another step, trimming away the bumps and irregular edges sticking out from the slab's perimeter. Working with something this heavy and unwieldy means you can't afford to be careless. When you're cutting through wood that's several inches thick, you need a blade designed for resawing. The slab moves through at a patient, controlled pace. Rushing it would be a mistake. The person running the saw has to keep tabs on several things at once: how tight the blade is, where the upper guide sits, and how the wood is positioned as it moves through. End grain that's full of knots and irregular growth patterns can suddenly twist or shift when pressure hits it. The edges of this stump are nowhere near straight, so measuring angles becomes part of the process. You can see him using right-angle jigs to make sure the drill goes straight down instead of wandering. The connection method here is wooden dowels, basically round hardwood pins that furniture makers use all the time. A corded drill with a depth stop bores the holes, preventing them from going too deep. Each section gets matching holes drilled so the dowels fit perfectly between them. The holes go halfway down the length of each dowel, which lets them sit evenly between both pieces without sticking out. Once the dowels are positioned and glue is spread, the sections get pressed together. A few careful taps with a mallet seat, everything snugly and close any gaps between the parts. It helps to do this on a completely flat workspace covered with plastic sheeting. Otherwise, glue drips everywhere and makes a mess. The adhesive used here is usually PVA wood glue, known for creating rock-solid bonds. Once it sets, usually somewhere between half a day and a full day, there might still be minor bumps or edges that don't match up perfectly. When dowel joints are done right, like these ones, you can barely tell where the pieces were joined once everything's been sanded smooth and finished. There are spots where dowels aren't practical, maybe the wood's too thin or the shape is too complicated. Next, thin boards get cut to fit inside the hollow spaces in the table, creating a decorative inlay effect. The way the wood grain runs matters here. Choosing between radial or flat sawn patterns depends on what looks best against the stump's natural texture. When you're dealing with really deep cavities, you might stack multiple pieces or create stepped levels with built-in ledges that act as stoppers. But here's what matters most before anything goes into those holes. You need the entire top surface absolutely level and smooth. So you grab a random orbital sander and start with something fairly aggressive, think medium or coarse grit, to bring everything to the same height. Why does this matter? Because when you eventually fit those inlay pieces, you don't want them sticking up like a sore thumb or sinking below the wood around them. After you've figured out where all the gaps are and what size they need to be, it's time to actually build the decorative piece that'll fill them. The pattern gets arranged and assembled right there on a flat wooden backing board. When everything looks right and you're happy with how it's coming together, you start permanently joining the pieces. You're using regular wood glue, PVA, applied where the edges of each segment touch, basically turning the whole design into one solid wooden piece. To keep everything from sliding around while it dries, you might use some light clamping, tape it down with painter's tape, or even use caulk as a temporary hold. Now that you've got the shape marked out, you're ready to cut. The blade stays low to the surface, and you feed the material through slowly and steadily. Rushing it will just make the blade wander or flex. Since natural voids aren't perfectly shaped and the walls might tilt at weird angles, that first cut is usually intentionally a bit bigger than needed. This gives you some wiggle room for fine-tuning later. Cutting an inlay piece isn't like cutting regular lumber or making straight cuts on a mill. This takes real finesse. The gap you're trying to fill wasn't planned out on a computer. It's the result of wrought time and whatever nature threw at the tree. You drop the piece into the hole and wiggle it around to see where it's binding. Want to know exactly where? Rub some graphite or chalk around the edge of the cavity, then push the insert down. The powder will stick to whatever's too high, showing you exactly what needs to come off. Glue gets spread across the bottom and up the sides of the cavity in an even coat. Then the mosaic panel goes in, carefully lined up to match the marks you made earlier. Since you tapered the back edges slightly when you were fitting it, the panel slides right in without jamming or catching on anything. The edges get extra love here, particularly the sanding and how one curve flows into another. This matters even more when you're keeping that raw, natural edge intact. From there, he switches gears to build a circular base for the table, and it's seriously impressive. He starts by tracing a circular template onto the wood, mapping out exactly where the outer edge and ring thickness need to be. Once that's locked in, the bandsaw comes into play, standing upright, ready to slice through. Maneuvering that chunky, uneven piece of wood through the blade takes real skill, but he cuts straight through the middle. Now he's got two halves that are way easier to handle, and those get broken down even further into individual chunks. All those chunks, they're gonna form a ring that echoes the tree's original round shape. He tweaks and spins each one until the joints fit snugly, paying attention to which way the grain runs and how the wood naturally bends. When everything lines up right, he marks where things need trimming, especially on the inside curve. After cutting, he drills guide holes where the pieces meet, making room for some serious screws. This spreads the clamping force evenly and keeps everything from shifting around, whether from the wood settling or the clamp slipping. He slathers glue generously on the surfaces that'll touch, then pushes the segments together. He applies pressure by hand first, then locks it down with clamps to kick off the bonding. Those pre-drilled holes, they stop the wood from cracking when the screws go in and keep the screws tracking exactly where they should. Once those support screws thread into the guide holes, they basically become permanent clamps. They squeeze inward on the glued seams, stopping any side-to-side movement or twisting. That instant mechanical grip is huge, especially when forces try to pry the joints open. After the glue cures, it carries most of the weight in holding things together. But here's the thing, a circular ring gets stressed from all angles and directions. Glue by itself can be risky if moisture gets in and weakens even a small section. You could have problems. That's where those screws earn their keep, physically hooking the wood fibers into each other as a backup. Plus, the way the screws angle through maximizes their grip across the wood grain. To smooth everything out, he brings in a belt sander loaded with rough grit paper. With a light hand and some freeform motion, this thing levels out bumpy joints surprisingly fast. Blending the ring seamlessly into the slab's organic contours makes the whole thing look like one continuous piece. Next up, things get way more mathematical and exacting. He's creating a mosaic pattern using identical hexagons, and this kind of layout requires serious precision. Every single hexagon gets measured carefully so it fits exactly inside that ring's inner circle. For the hexagonal tiles, the wood selection matters on two fronts. It needs to stay dimensionally stable over time, and it should provide strong visual contrast. The boards get planed down to match the exact depth of the ring's cavity. Before any adhesive gets involved, the full mosaic gets laid out dry. This test-fitting stage catches alignment issues early. When everything looks right, the mosaic gets laminated onto a circular plywood backing using wood glue under even pressure. What you end up with is a single structurally sound panel ready to drop into the ring. After the glue cures, it's time to trim the panel down. The ring's inner wall gets traced onto the panel as a cutting guide. A bandsaw handles the bulk of the excess material, and then a flush trim router bit, working off a flexible template, dials in the precision. Getting the mosaic insert to mate perfectly with the ring means custom fitting the outer edge. The shaping starts by mapping the ring's internal curve onto the back of the mosaic. The panel sits centered over the ring, and a marking gauge traces the cavity's exact profile. That traced line captures all the little quirks and irregularities of the cavity, making it the definitive reference for trimming. When cutting, you leave about 1 to 2 millimeters of extra material beyond the traced line. The idea isn't to nail the final fit right away, it's to quickly shed the bulk while keeping that traced edge intact. Now comes the flush trim routing, which refines the panel to its final profile. The adhesive choice here matters. This is a tight, high-stress joint. A thick urethane glue or gap-filling epoxy works best for this application. These adhesives create strong bonds and fill in the tiny gaps or surface irregularities along the cavity wall. Both the ring's inner edge and the mosaic's outer perimeter get a generous coat. The first leveling pass uses a handheld electric planer to bring the mosaic flush with the surrounding wood. This knocks down any height differences between the inlay and the ring's surface, establishing a uniform plane. After the surface is level, a random orbital sander takes over. Working through progressively finer grits, it smooths out both the mosaic and the surrounding wood. The aim is to erase every sanding scratch and create a seamless feel across all the different materials. The craftsman pays careful attention to how the wood's natural texture flows, keeping that authentic, untouched character while making the visual details pop. When everything's ready, a premium varnish gets applied to bring out the best in both the wood and the mosaic details. Once the varnish sets, it creates a tough see-through shield that keeps moisture out, blocks UV damage, and prevents scratches. You'll usually see several rounds of application, with gentle sanding happening between each one to get that perfectly smooth, almost glass-like surface. When it's all done, this 3-part coffee table draws your eyes around in circles. You start at the hefty old-growth root system, travel up the live-edge wood slabs, and land on those sharp, precise mosaic patterns. Then something clicks. You realize there are actually 3 separate tops, each sitting at its own height. Those subtle differences in elevation give the whole thing a sense of movement and space, keeping that massive root base from looking too heavy or imposing. The root stays basically as nature made it, but where the wood was cut, you see those light sapwood rings. Within those rings, the mosaics speak in perfect angles and shapes. The golden yellows, rich browns, and earthy tones in the tiles mirror the colors you find in the bark's cracks and crevices. So even though the forms are totally different, the colors tie everything together. The shiny varnish catches light across both the wood grain and the tile edges, giving everything a consistent glow. And here's a cool detail. Since the tops extend slightly past the base, each section looks lighter than it actually is. Those wavy, irregular live edges soften all that circular precision and keep it from looking too technical or planned. You've got the weight and history of a century-old stump mixed with something that feels modern and almost whimsical thanks to those sharp geometric cutouts.